Do you want an affordable compact sedan? Sure you do. This new Jetta starts around $18,000, and at that price point, you know there's going to be some trade-offs, so let's get right into it. Take a look at the exterior of the new Jetta. This color aside, it's certainly not going to win any awards for creativity. This is definitely one of the most conservative looking vehicles in the segment. There's no crazy lines, waves, or anything that's really trying to stand out. It's basically as clean as you can get. It's super mature. And from the outside, when you look at it, you think, okay, this is probably a more upscale car because of it. But it kind of embodies what Volkswagen's trying to do from a design standpoint. And you take that outside look and you come right on the interior and it is the same story. There is no craziness with intersecting lines or crazy textures or fancy pants door panels. This is exactly what you see in the Audi and VW division's design mantra. This is a sterile space. It is got a very simplistic look in terms of textures, shapes. They haven't gone off the deep end of materials. Yes, there's some piano gloss plastics here on the HVAC controls and steering wheel, but it's not overdone. They use silver across the center part of the dashboard, and I think for the most part, once you get in here and get used to it, it's definitely one of the better designs because it holds up to the test of time. This is going to be the same look and feel that has worked and will continue to work for another 10 years. Now people are going to wonder, is this car quiet? It's a Volkswagen, but at this price point, it's not really going to blow you away. There is wind noise. You can hear it coming from the doors. You know, there's no acoustic laminated glass, and why would there be at $17,000 to $22,000? It's pretty much on par with some of the other vehicles. Now, if you're looking for the ultimate in quietness, I think the Elantra is probably one of the better in the class if you want that isolated feel. This kind of gives you a blend. But I think most of the noise is coming from the 1.4 liter, which is direct injected, and in the cold, it definitely sounds more dieselish, and they don't have a cover over it to isolate it either. But everything else is put together really well. I mean, the fit and finish is pretty damn good. The buttons, the ergonomics, it's exactly what you'd expect from a VW. Now, the seating surfaces, they don't feel super cheap. And when you first sit in here, namely in the front seats and in the back, you're going to notice they feel comfortable. There's no, electronic adjustment on the R line here. And I think for about 20 minutes, you're like, I like this car. And I drove it for about an hour and a half yesterday, and that's really when you start to notice these seats don't have the best padding. And again, it just goes back to the price point. You can't have every single thing you want. This is not a luxury car. But at the same time, I think it makes up for it in other ways because pretty much all the instrumentation, the steering wheel, all the things that you interact with feel very high quality, that you wouldn't expect this to be a budget car. Now, because this is a cheap car, people are going to be like, oh, great, we're going to have to suffer in the technology department. And I would say, no, this is truly one of the better integrations of any of the affordable cars. And there's a couple reasons why. So they're using the MIB2 infotainment, which was originally designed by Panasonic, and they've sped it up, they've polished it. And this infotainment is one of the faster ones that you're going to use. It's one of the more reliable. It pairs up with your phone really well, and everything is simple to get around for the most part. The screen also has one of the best black levels and contrast levels of any screen pretty much on the market, which means it's super black. It's not bright at night. So you can have it on full brightness and it doesn't blind you, which is amazing. The second thing they do really well is the integration with this center digital screen. Now they have the traditional analog tachometer and speedometer here, but they have a small screen that gives you more information. And the best part is you can set this screen to turn off at night after like 10 seconds of use. And you can use pretty much all everything you need is right in the center screen. So like if I want to adjust my volume on a Hyundai or a Kia or a Toyota, when I hit the volume button, it turns this whole screen on just to tell me the volume. Not on VW, it will tell you the volume here and it will leave this off. And there's smart integrations like that in this car. It tells you oil temperature, it tells you all the core functions you need without having to completely use this all the time. The HVAC controls are completely separated from the screen, so you don't ever need to use this. And that is why this car does it so well. Now, the last point is this does not have the upgraded audio system. And I'm going to tell you on the R-Line, this is one of the worst sounding audio systems I've ever heard. I mean, you have to go back almost like 15 years to get something that sounds this bad. It's flat, the highs are bad, the mids are bad, the bass is kind of muddy. It just does not sound good. And I typically don't talk about that in cars, but this definitely stands out as being way below average. So if you like listening to music, you almost have to go to the higher end audio system just because of that in this car. But other than that, everything else is pretty solid. Now, I think the biggest thing and one of the last things to talk about is the room to grow. This isn't much bigger than the previous Jetta, but I feel like there is a ton of space in here. I do feel like if you're a larger person, there's enough adjustments in the seats. If you're wider, if you're taller, and it same goes from the back seats. They feel very comfortable. Now, I know that the trunk was slightly shrunken down from the previous generation, but you just don't notice it that much. It is still a pretty large space overall. And I think that's the key thing. This is a very usable, practical car without totally destroying your wallet. But enough of that. Let's take a look at the underbody and then get this thing out on the road. You've made it to the underbody section with the 2019 Jetta on the Benpack lift. And you may or may not know this, but it's vastly different than the previous generation Jetta. And that's because VW has employed their new MQB platform here, the same that we saw with the Golf and the Tiguan. And this entire chassis is modular, which means they can make multiple cars off the same underpinnings and change and tweak certain things. And they can put different models on the same manufacturing line because a lot of these pieces are similar, which means, one, it's quicker to make, it's quicker to modify, shorter life cycles, it's cheaper to make tweaks, and cost savings, which they're actually passing on to the customer here. This is cheaper than the previous generation one. But when you look at this, since I've just got done looking at the Kia Forte, you see how many similarities there are now between manufacturers in this class. Stamped steel lower control arms. Your knuckle is cast steel, but you can see it's a smaller piece, much like the Forte. The subframes are all stamped steel, and you have strut front suspensions. This is about the most generic, cheapest, simplest process you're going to see, and pretty much every car like this is the same, and almost you can't tell them apart. Now, the difference with the VW is this is more covered up than most of the cars, and one negative part is rigid as this under tray is, and it has a lower drag coefficient than the previous car, but you can't get to your serviceable items here without dropping this tray, which is about 10 bolts. So you can't get to your oil filter and plug without dropping this, and that's kind of annoying. But let's take a look at the rear half of the car. In the back of the Jetta, the first thing I saw was how often I'm reminded that this car's made in Mexico. It's stamped on everything. The next part is, well, the fake exhaust tips, and this is becoming a bigger trend. And it's often being done because with direct injected motors, if you have exhaust shooting out to chrome exhaust tips, well, they turn black from all the soot. So now to solve it, they're shooting the exhaust on the ground and putting fake exhaust finishers on, which is actually kind of weird, but a lot of people hate that. The next thing is a big thing. Well, this big chasm that's here, this empty space. And you might be wondering, well, what's that for? Well, I figured out something. I'm going to use it to mount and hang all my trinkets, like my old camera gear or my toilet paper, or you name it. I can hold my bread, my pantry supplies in here and make this a more useful vehicle. But the reality is this space, because it's a modular car, they've removed independent rear suspension that other models have. And the reason they've done that here is for two reasons. One, to save cost, because it costs anywhere between $200 to $400 per, depending on the manufacturer, per car. So they're saving a ton of money there. The next thing is they're removing it to save weight. This saves 44 pounds over an independent rear suspension. The negative part is it affects handling and ride quality by doing this. It's worse here than it would be with an independent rear. Now, there's only 2 companies now in this segment that are sticking with independent rear suspension. That's Honda with the Civic and Toyota with the new Corolla. Pretty much everybody else is going away from it until you get to higher end models where they start to add it back. And it depends if it's a big deal to you or not. The main reason it's gone is because customers don't care about this anymore. They want all the tech on the inside of the car. And that's really one of the most expensive parts of modern vehicles to develop, is all that software. But enough of that, let's take a look under the hood. Under the hood of the Jetta is a 1.4 liter turbo engine, and this is the only option. It's direct injected, it has an aluminum head and block, and this turbo does not have an intercooler. They use a module attached to the intake manifold to cool it that way using coolant. The exhaust manifold is integrated into the head with a water jacket, so needless to say, the cooling system has a lot of work to do here. And a lot of this design is to reduce emissions and improve fuel economy. All this heat that they're generating helps to get that catalytic converter up to temperature and all the things that modern engines have to deal with and design. And, you know, it's not a bad engine in terms of driving it. It's exactly what you expect from an Eco 4-popper. But the main thing is the transmission. Torque converted unit, it's pretty smooth, quick to respond, and then they give you the XDS system, which is an electronic, somewhat of electronic limited slip. It's not a mechanical thing. So it's braking each wheel, depending on your direction and loss of traction, help keep you on the road to reduce understeer that way. And that's exclusive to the R line. Let's take this thing for a drive. Driving the Jetta for the first time, and I talked about the interior, exterior, the underbody. There's this mix of maturity, there's a mix of refinement to its design, and then you have the driving aspect. And this is kind of important, right? And this is where you definitely feel some cost cutting. It is a lot noisier than you would expect on the interior cabin. And driving it, you know, it feels very kind of mature and sterile on the inside, and you expect some of the more luxury car traits to it, and you just don't get it here. It's little things like the wind noise from the door areas. When you accelerate, I'm just gonna mash it down here for a second. There's this rattle or sound, and it sounds like it's coming from the engine or the turbo. There's like this turbo noise, but I feel like it's a rattle in the door. It's so strange. It's just not a car that is, it definitely feels like a compact car, even though it doesn't look like it. So I think that's my biggest surprise in driving this, and it's not necessarily that it's a bad thing, because you're getting a lot of car for your money. You're getting a vehicle that is definitely not gimmicky or, you know, childish. And one of the better things about it is just the way that it drives, like in terms of handling and ride quality. Despite it having a torsion beam rear end, I feel like this car does a really good job at being nimble, lightweight feeling to get around. The steering is pretty good without being synthetically boosted. The brakes are pretty progressive without being like an on and off switch. So I like that aspect. But let's just set this thing off the line here. See how the automatic transmission and the motor handles driving and then manually controlling it through the automatic. Now the big thing with the transmission is I feel like the gearing is pretty tall, namely in third or fourth. It gets you off the line pretty quick in first, surprisingly quick, and then second is normal, and then third it's like, it almost has like this rubber banding effect like a CVT would, just because the gearing is so skewed towards kind of keeping it in that torque band. This is not a car that is going to excite you in terms of acceleration. I'm just going to be totally fair about it. And it's not like any of the other cars in this segment are going to blow you away. This is definitely geared towards fuel efficiency. The turbo that's on here, despite it being a low displacement car, it gives you a ton of torque, and that's really what you're feeling here. You don't have to work this car in your day-to-day driving experience. It has just enough power to kind of get you going, where you almost don't feel like you're driving a 4-cylinder. It feels like a small V6, and I know that's the whole point of these eco-turbo cars, but I think that's the best part, is just the overall engine performance is better than some of the other contenders in this segment. And I think the last thing to really talk about is, steering, and I get sick of this, and you notice it a lot with the Hyundais and Kias. The steering is way, way, way synthetically over-quickened. This feels a lot more natural, and I think they do a good job for a car like this, that it's not, nothing about its reflexes are overdone. Basically everything from steering, braking, acceleration, all of it matches up to the characteristics of this car. And that's where this becomes a much more balanced machine, and namely with the ride quality. I said this about the Forte, which I just got done doing a video on, that the ride quality is way too stiff for what it was. It just was way too firm for a car that you're gonna tool around every day. This has a softer ride, and despite the torsion beam, you never get choppy. It just never feels choppy over broken pavement. It always feels smooth and comfortable, and I think that's why you would choose the Jetta over some of its counterparts. It's that more grown-up car that they understand people are going to drive this every day on a boring-ass commute. And, that's, again, its strongest suit. Final thoughts on the new Jetta. And I've done more thinking about this vehicle than I do most, and that's because it's left me with a sense of confusion, which I'll cover in a minute. But let's talk about the good things it does, namely compared to the other vehicles in its class. Its ride quality. It's much softer than some of the other compacts. VW knows that probably people are going to be using this as a cruiser. And while, cars like the Civic or the Forte go on this firmer feel, this more confidence-inspiring, sporty feel, this goes towards the other end, and you float over every pavement type. And if you live in an area with bad pavement like Illinois or Michigan, you're going to appreciate this. Now, that doesn't mean it's the best handling car. It's a little bit floaty, but I think if you're driving every day, you're going to appreciate that. The next thing is how well they integrate the technology, namely the infotainment and the gauge cluster together. I like the way that they've approached the electronics. They're not overbearing, they're still simple, and I think that connects to the other elements of this car. It's a classic design. It may not be the most inspiring, the most edgy, the most modern, but guaranteed in 10 years, you're gonna still be like, well, that looks like every other VW. It's just immediately recognizable as a VW car. And in that case, it's not gonna have a lot of things that are gonna age poorly. Now, of course, there's the counterpoint. It's pretty boring. It's just sterile looking, and that might be what you want. So that's a pro or a con. But the last thing is, where it confuses me is this looks more upscale. It looks more like something in the mid-size or upper mid-size segment, and then you get on the inside, you drive it, and it just has this sense of cheapness to it. And I know that it's $17,000 to start or $18,000 to start. It just still, like, what you perceive it to be is not like how you feel when you drive it. There's creaks, there's rattles, there's weird buzzing, or sounds like there's a boost leak when you accelerate flat out. The transmission performance is off on this, and the more I drove it, namely in the cold, I thought it was a dual clutch in the cold, because you put it into gear, drive, or reverse, and there's like this immediate lurching, and it almost stalls in reverse when it was colder. There's just this weird behavior in the torque converter, and I don't know if it's programming or stall rates, I don't know, but there's definitely something weird about how they have this transmission tuned. The motor was smooth for the most part, but I don't know, that's why I'm confused by it. It's a great car in some ways, and other cars you just can't escape its price point. It's another one of these say it all the time, you got to drive other cars back to back with it to really kind of find the nuances of it. But I hope that helps. Take care, and I'll see you next video.
This savage geese, I hate him, I hate him. I'm gonna show you how to get back at him on Yelp and all that other stuff.